Hello and welcome to What's in It for Africa, the November edition of Inside the Issue. This month we discuss the revision of the new EU rules on biofuels and how they impact the African countries. The EU is moving away from food-based biofuels in order to take into account some of the increasing scientific evidence that questions the environmental credibility of first-generation biofuels over fossil fuels and other advanced biofuels. It's also changing its rules on this topic in order to prevent or guard against any possibilities that food crops are being diverted in order to make fuel. And the African impact. Well, several African countries, including Tanzania, Mozambique and Nigeria, to name a few, have seen vast increase in investments in biofuel production from European companies. And this has been a result of EU demand fueled by its policy. So let's speak to the policy experts, member of the European Parliament, Seb Dance, and Dr Marc Londo from the European Biofuels Technology Platform. We have the pleasure of being joined by Dr Marc Londo. He's a seasoned researcher and academic on renewable energy policy, but also the co-chair of a working group on policy and sustainability, part of the European Biofuels Technology Platform. Thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you. So we're discussing EU biofuels policy today. I wanted to ask you to explain to our viewers, how does EU biofuels policy impact the global market, and specifically how does it impact the African market?
Well, when it comes to the biofuels market, then of course Europe is one of the big biofuel sectors, or biofuel players, together with the United States and with Brazil. But when it comes to the feedstocks for biofuels, which are currently mostly food-based materials, so food crops, then the impact of the size and the share of biofuels is still relatively limited compared to food and feed use, and that applies for all countries and all continents. So yes, there is let's say feedstock production for biofuels, but the sizes of the agricultural markets for food and feed are still massively bigger than the one for biofuels.
So I'm hearing that it's quite a small market at the moment. So moving on to the political discussions that are happening now in Brussels on European biofuels legislation and focusing away from food-based sources and looking at moving towards non-food-based sources, or at least encouraging their production and use. I'd just like to know from you whether you think that this is perhaps the start of the end of an EU demand for food-based biofuels?
I think it's too early to answer that question. I think that the current, let's say, pause in the further development of food-based biofuels is sensible, because we had a massive discussion on the sustainability of food-based biofuels, on land use change impacts, on indirect land use change, which couldn't be pacified by proper science yet. And therefore, I mean, there are some signs that biofuels can have very unsustainable impacts, while on the other hand, when properly organized, it can have a very beneficial sustainability impact, but the jury is still out. So therefore, that now the European Commission has said, well, we'll cap it to 7%, and for the coming years at least, that's our maximum. I think that is a safe compromise to at least avoid the worst negative impacts on the short term. Now on the longer term, if, for example, the agricultural and the land use sectors in general will be able to strongly improve their agricultural productivity, and essentially if we're able to feed the world and come up with surpluses in production that might be available for biofuels, there's no basic reason why it should be limited to 7% in the long term. Okay. But that's a big if, because there's still hunger in the world, there are still massively unsustainable agricultural practices in the world. If we can change that play, there might become also more room for more food-based biofuels. But if food scarcity remains an issue and many regions with massive potential for further improvements don't improve their productivity, that it might be difficult to come along and with a higher target on the long term either. And it might be even the end of food-based biofuels in the long run.
So moving it on to the African context, We know that 60% of unutilised land is actually on the African continent. We also know that European companies have been investing heavily in producing food for the use of biofuels in Nigeria, South Africa, Tanzania, quite a few African countries to name a few. I'd like to know from you what you think this shift away from food-based biofuels will mean for the African market, the governments, but also the agricultural sector.
Yeah. Well, it might be that the demand for these kind of biofuels from Europe doesn't grow that steadily after 2020 as might have been expected earlier on. On the other hand, it might also open up the opportunity for African countries to produce their own biofuels for domestic use. I mean, one of the major problems of many African countries is their trade deficit, which is partly based on oil imports. If you're able to produce your own biofuels domestically, of course, it's just better for your domestic economy. And the problem only is, will you be able to produce both biofuels and cope with the challenges in food production for your own people, for example? And there you see that a lot of criticism on biofuels is coming from people who see it as a big threat to food production and hunger problems in Africa. While on the other hand, producing biofuels and improving agricultural practices for food production could go together. I mean, sometimes it's even the same crops. You need to have a better agricultural infrastructure for both sectors. So there might be less demand for Europe, but there might be a better case to come up with a good, sustainable strategy for biofuels development for domestic African use.
We are honoured to be joined by Seb Dance today. He's a UK member of the European Parliament, and he's also one of a handful of parliamentarians currently looking at the revision of the EU biofuels legislation. He also sits on a number of parliamentary committees, including those dealing with environmental issues, development policy, and the EU relations with the African, Caribbean and Pacific group of states. Thank you for joining us today.
You're welcome.
The EU legislation on biofuels, what's in it for Africa?
What's in it for Africa is the potential now for a much better relationship between the companies that are seeking to start business in local areas, in terms of the relationship between the communities and access to land rights, and knowing that the areas that the crops will be grown will not be used to displace farming, knowing that the relationship between the broader economy and importing and exporting to and from the European Union, that relationship is secured, so knowing that obviously builds long-term security for communities and countries that are looking to further increase the relationship in trade with the European Union. And also it obviously diversifies the energy mix, not just for the EU but for Africa as well. And that is going to be incredibly important as we go forward, because we have to find a way of decarbonising as much as possible the sources of energy that we use. I don't think anyone in their right mind could possibly sit here and say to Africa that there is no room for further economic development because effectively we've used up all of the planet's resources. That is unacceptable. So we have to find a way where we can allow countries to develop their economies to use more energy in a way that doesn't degrade the environment, and that points to a significant role for advanced biofuels.
And how would you say that the EU legislation on this particular issue on biofuels has had an impact on the production in sub-Saharan Africa?
I think the European impact has been huge. The drive for biofuels as an alternative to more traditional sources of fuel, oil, gas, coal, for example, from fossil fuels. The alternative that was pushed for was obviously driven from a need both to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to increase stability and security in terms of supply, but also to create new areas of trade with parts of the world where perhaps trade wasn't as strong as it could be. So in terms of the initial drive, that was a huge push factor coming from the European Union. Of course, the unintended consequences that have come out of that have had a series of far-reaching consequences, including not necessarily reducing greenhouse gases, increasing instability when it comes to food production, and creating a lot of mistrust in areas where previously agreed arrangements, such as the access to land that was put in place by some of the companies that did the initial exploration, that has not been followed through. So I think, what started off as a good policy very quickly became a policy of unintended consequences. We see that in a number of areas, and not just in the EU. So the job really is to make sure that we deal with those unintended consequences and get to the place that we initially wanted to see, which obviously was to deal with the 3 points I raised at the beginning.
Yeah. And to really focus a bit more on the potential, I understand there are some very, kind of environmental concerns that are very important and we need to take into account. Do you think perhaps that it is also an opportunity, this growing EU demand for biofuels and production in Africa, for countries that suffer from a trade deficit, mainly due to the fact of a dependence on oil imports like Mozambique and Tanzania and South Africa, perhaps to secure their own energy supply from local production? How far is that really true or possible?
Yeah, I think it's entirely possible as long as we get it right. I mean, the problem that we've had is that the first generation crops were very water intensive. The quality of the land that was required to grow them was necessarily very high, which of course meant displacing traditional sources of arable land. It's absolutely possible now with advanced biofuels, with the next generation of crops that can be used to create biofuels, not to grow on area that is necessary to grow food on, so you can use much lower quality areas of soil that would not otherwise be used for crop production, that use far less water, therefore obviously reducing the stress on many water tables in areas that are already water stressed. So that potential absolutely exists. We just have to make sure that the industry has the right signals in terms of the amount of investment that's required to move away from first generation to subsequent generations, and that signal is the important bit, and that's the key role that the EU has.
So yes, the potential of diverting food crops to be used to produce fuel is very much a concern, especially on a continent that's home to 220 million hungry people. But I'm not yet convinced it means a no-go for biofuel production in Africa, especially because it's home to 60% of the world's unutilised land. Also, African countries are thirsty for a way out of dependence on oil imports, so that they can continue to biofuel Europe. So that's it for this month's Inside the Issue. Thank you for watching. Join us in 2 weeks' time for the EU Africa update. Subscribe to our channel on YouTube, follow us on Twitter, and stay tuned. My name is Uzo Madu for What's in It for Africa.